Hi there, everybody out there. I think we are live now. So, hello and welcome to this panel discussion on the future of DEI. I'm thrilled to have you. I am Andrea Adams, the host of this panel and the host of the HR Hub. And we are live on YouTube and LinkedIn today for a purposeful discussion on the future of DEI. So many people who either are on the panel or are out there watching have dedicated their careers to DEI, and with good reason. There's just so many ongoing examples of inequity and unfairness in the workplace, and yet there's so much pushback right now as well. We've seen Elon Musk post that DEI must die, and SHRM has recently removed the E from DEI, and we could go on for a long time with the examples, but what I really want to hear from today is the panel. Now, what I would like to do is introduce the panel. So we have an awesome panel today that I'm really excited to learn from, all very highly experienced people who are going to provide some insight on the topic. In no particular order, I'd like to introduce Sarah Taylor. Sarah, wave. Sarah's from Minneapolis, St. Paul area. She's the author of a recent book called Thinking at the Speed of Bias, and the author of another best-selling book called Filter Shift. She is a consultant and owner of Deep Sea Consulting and has 35 years of experience in this field, which is amazing. Next, I want to introduce Amy Hull. Amy's based out of Cincinnati. She's the head of DEI for Paycor. She's a consultant and former school administrator. And she told us that she recently won a bronze award from Brandon Hope for her DEI strategy. She's also working on authoring her first book on the relationship between power and empathy. Welcome, Amy. Our third panelist is going to be Dr. Lino Caramoncheri. Lino has a PhD in sociology and equity studies from the University of Toronto. He's an author of a number of books, including an upcoming book that's really relevant called The Old Black Lesbian Elephant in the Room, Why the Woke Need to Wake Up. He heads up Mesh Diversity, which takes a numbers and data science approach to helping organizations with their DEI. And finally, the final panelist is Toby Milden. Toby is coming to us late in the day from the UK. He's the author of Inclusive Growth and hosts a podcast by the same name. This year, he released another book called Building Inclusivity. He runs Milden Consultancy and previously worked for Deloitte, Accenture, and the BBC. Now, that's the introductions. I'm going to start with a general question to each of them and give them 2 minutes to comment on where they think we should be going next in DEI. And again, in no particular order, I am going to turn it over to Sarah. Sarah, what do you think about the future of DEI?
Absolutely. Well, I am positive and hopeful. I do believe that this is a turning point. And in any turning points, I think there are things that we need to shed of the past. And particularly organizations and practitioners that have done this work without a deep expertise and without fully committing to the transformation that needs to take place. We need to give ourselves a little bit of credit in the fact that we are a very, very young practice. We're not an old practice like medicine or law. We are very, very young. And in that youth, we are still figuring things out. But one thing that we know for sure that needs to continue into the future is less transactional approaches and more transformational approaches that really have the focus of organizational and systemic change to actually impact the inequities that we see across the globe. So I'm, in a nutshell, hopeful that we can move, that this resistance now will force us to move more into that transformational approach.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. All right. Now, Amy, your thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree. Hopeful. Always, I'm a hopelessly devoted to it anyway. But always hopeful for progress and change. I would say currently the resistance to anything that has been focused on people who are underrepresented and I'll speak specifically around like the states, the United States, and probably some other places as well, has been cyclical. So, I disagree that it's a growing resistance. I would say it's more of a cyclical resistance. When progress is made, typically there's a resistance in change, no matter what the change is. You experience an implementation dip, if you will. There's always going to be some type of a resistance when change occurs, and it's how we adapt and move inside of that change that makes the difference. I think one of the things, two things that are really going to be a priority as we move forward are overcoming our fear of loss of power and reigniting the fuel behind empathy and the building of community. So like moving from this like hoarding of self to the good of all, I think is going to be really important as we move forward and make progress in this field. There's a lot of people that are suffering from a tyranny of comparison, even adults. And it's keeping us from not having, that fear of not having enough to survive. We see it even in students and our, adults who are sending their kids to college and they're comparing who's going where, so it's like this competition internally with our community rather than us all working together. So moving forward, I see that being a really big part of any progress that we make from here.
All right, Lino. Thanks, Amy and Lino. Over to you.
Yeah, I don't know how hopeful I am. After George Floyd, I think there was a pretty large, near global impetus to drive this forward. Unfortunately, I think what happened is, by way of the DEI movement, an awful lot of exceedingly well-meaning folks who had little to no expertise or experience in the field jumped in. Like anybody can hang a shingle saying, I'm a DEI expert. And the problem is on that consultancy piece, but internally in organizations, and largely large organizations, HR folks were kind of left to flap in the breeze. It was put out, you got the portfolio, even if you had no expertise, and half the time it was on the side of your desk. The big challenge is recognizing the problem for what it is and not the surface level stuff. It's not, the D gets a lot of focus in the DEI piece, the diversity piece. And so oftentimes organizations end up counting heads as opposed to ensuring those heads count, right? And so, the best metaphor I could give you is that for the last 20 years of DEI work, it's gotten amplified in the last 3 or 4. The last 20 years of DEI work, it's like if you were in a boat full of water and I threw you a pail, I'm sure you'd be super appreciative until you discover there's holes in the hull, right? The pail's not going to help. And so my hope in the field comes with organizations that genuinely recognize the need, genuinely want to make change, actually put real resources in, actually look at the real problems, not the superfluous surface level stuff, and really drive at engaging this in a way that it'll have meaning for everybody, not just the minoritized folks. And DEI is done right. It's not just for the minoritized folks, it's for everybody. And in that way, you cut down on the friction. This is an HR kind of thing here we're doing. And so everybody who's in HR will appreciate what I'm going to say. Any change process you engage in, 20% of people jump on board before you start. They're happy with change. They're optimistic. They want to grow. 30% of people fight you tooth and nail no matter what the change process is. It doesn't even matter if it's going to be good for them. And 50% of folks sit right on a fence. They're the pliable 50. You got to give them a reason to move one way or the other. The challenge with the way DEI has been done is kind of focused on either the 20 who are engaged or trying to address the concerns of the 30 at the back. You got to get the 50 in the middle. You get the 50 in the middle, you got a nice critical mass of 70, and then you got room to move. I have no clue if I answered the question.
Oh, so interesting though. I'm not sure. I just wanted your thoughts on the direction of, your thoughts on the future of DEI. And I look forward to digging into some of that as we go through our discussion today. But before we get there, final introductions. Toby, can you share your thoughts about the future or presence or past of DEI?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I think here in the UK, there's been a lot of unhelpful rhetoric around diversity and inclusion, particularly coming out of politics. So we had a general election this year. Leading up to the general election and with our previous government, there was a lot of kind of negativity and rhetoric around diversity and inclusion. We had politicians saying racist, homophobic, transphobic remarks. And then, of course, the media picking up on those, running those headlines. And the reason why I'm hopeful, though, is because there was a really fascinating report that the University of Oxford wrote, and they found out that in the UK, 94% of the UK population have heard about equity, diversity, and inclusion. 64% of the UK population thought that EDI was a good thing. The remaining 40 odd percent were largely kind of sitting on the fence. There's actually a small minority of people who were against it. Unfortunately, it's the small minority that seem to have the bigger voice. And I don't know if you heard recently, we had civil unrest in the UK where we had people out rioting on the streets. And unfortunately, it's the minority that are really amplifying it. But I am hopeful because the clients that I work with have told me that they are doubling down on diversity and inclusion. And the reason why they're doubling down on it is because they're making it a strategic priority. They want to be a company where people come to work, they can feel safe physically and psychologically. They're respected for who they are empowered, they're able to do their best work, and they're able to progress in their careers. And the organizations that I talk to, they want to double down on that. They want to make sure that within the four walls of their organization, they're creating this positive environment where everyone can thrive, regardless of their personal circumstances or backgrounds. And I think it was like, Sarah was saying, it's about companies shifting towards that transformational space, spending less time doing those box ticking activities, changing the color of your logo during LGBTQ plus History Month, really embedding it into the infrastructure and the culture, the systems and processes of your business to create an inclusive environment.
All right. Lots to think on there. Okay, so now I want to get into the body of the panel discussion. But the first question here is, and Lena referred to it, was that around the late teens and even before George Floyd, we had Me Too. And then we had the murder of George Floyd, and we were collectively outraged by that whole thing. And so many more people engaged deeply in DEI than maybe had previously. So, question, and I'm going to ask Toby to lead off on this. With all the attention and interest, have we made progress in the last few years? And if so, how?
My answer to this question is yes and no. If we think about the longer term horizon, we definitely have made progress in lots of different areas. If I think about my own personal lived experience as a disabled person, I was born in the 80s. I feel less prejudice and less discrimination as a disabled person nowadays than I did growing up in the 80s and the 90s. We've seen things shift over the 40 years. When I was born, there was no disability discrimination legislation here in the UK. That was first introduced in 1995. And then it was kind of updated in 2010 with the Equality Act when we merged various discrimination or equality legislation into one piece of legislation. So things have shifted and changed. But I do feel like sometimes with the work that we do, it's almost like we take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. A few years ago when George Floyd was murdered over in the States, even here in the UK, on the other side of the ocean, I saw business leaders responding, supporting their Black colleagues who were affected by the murder of George Floyd, really focusing on how they become anti-racist organizations. But then there was that kind of knee-jerk initial reaction. But I just feel like a lot of the energy has waned a bit. And I just feel like it's going to take another, major incident for things to kind of come back into the spotlight again, which shouldn't be the case. And it does worry me that leaders take their foot off the accelerator. But thankfully, we have lots of people working in the field of ED&I that are there, and I think largely it's the job that all of us do is to hold leaders to account, to make sure that they're not taking their eye off the ball. And so businesses need people like us, whether you work internally in an organization as an EDI practitioner, or whether you work with an organization on a kind of advisory or, advisory or consultancy basis, to make sure that that accountability remains in place.
You referred to that it might take another event, and that's sad. That's a little bit sad. But anyway. All right, Amy, your thoughts on this question of have we made progress and how? I'm interested in your perspective from the U.S.
Yeah. Even in response to Toby, I would say yes and no. I agree with that assessment. I think, progress, again, I agree long term of yes, there has been progress. But again, in reference to what Toby was mentioning with the murder of George Floyd, and to be honest, the murder of George Floyd and all of the others that are still happening. In fact, there was just an unfortunate murder of a woman in, I believe it was Louisville or Indianapolis, somewhere in the Midwest, who actually called the police for help and was murdered in her kitchen. So it's still happening. I think the difference is it's not on the main stage because everybody's not at home. So what was unique about and different about the murder of George Floyd is everyone could see it and everyone was paying attention because we didn't have anything else to do. we were all trapped in our homes at that time. And so while I agree, it could take another event. I don't know that event will hit or land in the same capacity as that did because not everyone is paying attention all of the time. And so an example of that is shortly following that with the surge of DE&I practitioners, to Lino's point earlier, in the U.S., there's a company called McKinsey & Company that does research. They put out a Women in the Workplace report every year. And that year, women of color surged to 96 for every 100 men. 96 women of color were appointed to positions of leadership. We are now back down to 54 for women of color, specific 54 for Black women, 65 for Latinas in the U.S. So it's short-lived because, to Toby's point, if it's surface level and it's not integrated into the systemic ways in which things happen, and that doesn't just happen in the company it has to happen holistically. And that is why, the progress will continue to be slow. It's not going to be something, in my opinion, it took us 400 years in the United States to get here. It's not going to take us 20 years to turn it all back around again. One thing I do want to mention, though, is we can't not do the work because it's not moving fast. So, to stay in it, the marathon philosophy, to stay in the race, to stay in the fight, and to all be working together and not against one another, is what I think is really going to make a huge difference moving forward.
Thanks, Amy. There was so much in that. And I hope we have an opportunity to delve into it more. I hadn't really thought about that a COVID perspective, and our attention was so on George Floyd. But you're right, things like that are happening in other circumstances. All right, but moving on to the next question, keep this moving along. As I said in the intro, and others have said here, there's pushback on DEI, with some organizations eliminating their DEI practices. So I'm going to ask Lino to lead off on this one. What criticisms of the way we've been practicing DEI, if we can generalize a little, are the most valid in your opinion, and what do we do about it? Lino?
Yeah, I think there's a perception challenge, right? It's the whole idea that everybody gets to believe what they believe, but your personal truth is not fact, right? The challenge is that we'll just call it the forces. The forces that would be against DEI have a pretty good media presence. They push a pretty clear message, and when you have people terrified of everything from identity politics to critical race theory to making them believe that DEI is punitive and that, if you don't comply, you're going to be in trouble. If you can get people terrified of DEI, then you're going to get some pushback, right? You don't need to have people in positions of power actually legislating the pushback. You just get you'll have people pushing back, and it doesn't help when folks on the left of left are kind of giving people a big stick to hit us with. The best way I would frame that, it's part of the reason I'm writing the book. When you just think about the concept of microaggressions or language policing, or even the fact that if you have DEI practitioners who are talking about everything from anti-oppression to white supremacy, right? If I'm in an academic setting and I start talking about white supremacy, the people in the academic room will, okay, you're talking about historical context and social formations and all of those other things that come together. But then when you're out there in the company and you start talking about white supremacy, you're really going to kind of piss people off. It's complex stuff. And if you throw people into the deep end of the pool and they don't know how to swim, don't be surprised when they're not happy with you, right? So I think that there are a number of general challenges that make some of this critique realistic. Most of the DEI work out there it's impractical. Most of it is not aligned with the business goals. Most of it's overly politicized. Most of it is incredibly divisive. And quite frankly, some of it is just silly. Really, really silly. I was on a panel during COVID, and there was a self-proclaimed DEI expert on the panel who informed this crowd of 500 people on the Zoom call that you should no longer use the word steps, because and her explanation was because some people are in wheelchairs. So you shouldn't say these are the steps we're going to take because some people are in wheelchairs. That's not just asinine, it's dangerous. And completely based in her own little ideas of right and wrong. I've heard recently you're not supposed to use the term brainstorm anymore. Now, in its origins in the 19th century, brainstorm was about mental activity and bursts of mental confusion. I get that. But in around 1940s, an advertising guy in the States, his name was Alex Osborne, wrote a book called Your Creative Power and kind of repurposed this term brainstorming to mean what it means to everybody else here today, right? And so brainstorm, you don't have to look back 100 years, say, it meant this back 100 years ago, so we can't use the term anymore. It's the kind of word policing that really puts people off. It makes you feel like you're walking on eggshells on a sea of glass, like I can't do anything right. Everybody who's listening, have you eaten pizza in the last month? And if you did you think you were eating Italian food? It's just pizza. 50 years ago, it was Italian food. But we move on. Language adapts, culture adapts. And if we spend all of our time focusing on these little bits of minutia that really serve no practical purpose, don't be surprised if people are critical of your approach. DEI work has to align to your business goals. It has to unlock performance and potential. It has to be practical and action-based. If it's anything other than these things, not only are you wasting your time, but you're causing friction that doesn't need to be there. You can put the best marks person in the planet 20 feet away from a target. They will hit it every single time. Now ask them to do it if you throw a bunch of junk in their way. And that's essentially what these approaches are doing, is throwing unnecessary junk in our way.
There's an art to that, knowing which friction is worth causing and which isn't. Sarah, can you share your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to, if all of that was a font, I'd underscore it and bold it and put it in a bright color. And also take a look at everything that you said, from another perspective, which is actually a stage of development. We know that there are 5 stages of development, and how effective we are in seeing the full complexity of differences and making effective, inclusive, and equitable decisions. 5 stages. And those loud voices that are resistant, that say DEI should DIE, are from the second stage. But guess what? Those other voices that you were mentioning, Lino, are also from the second stage. The voices that say you can't say steps anymore. The voices that say, this is all white supremacist, and so on and so forth. So that, to me, is akin to those 5 stages of development. If we relate that to a math ability, because that's what it is, it's an ability. If we relate it to a math ability and we said those 5 stages, and the 5th stage related to, metaphorically, a PhD level math problem, we've got PhD level DEI problems, and that are from that 5th stage, require that 5th stage of competence to resolve. Yet we have folks that are at that second stage, like middle schoolers fighting with each other back and forth. They might be the loudest voices in the room. They might be the most distracting voices in the room, but they are also some of the least competent, some of the least effective in actually solving these issues. And so it's not unless and until we really develop that we're going to be able to resolve the issues. And the other thing that we know about these stages of competence is not only that we need the higher level in order to actually create equity, but also we've never seen an organization that is more developed than its leaders or it's the folks that are leading DEI. So if you have your leadership team or your folks leading DEI that are coming from a middle school perspective trying to solve that PhD level problem, you're going to sit spinning with incomplete answers that aren't solving the true and transforming, once again, to true systemic equitable change.
So immediately I'm noticing a challenge that all of us doing this work have to strive to, if figuratively, bring ourselves up to that PhD level. Okay, moving on to the third question here. And Sarah, I'm actually going to ask you to lead off on this.
Sure.
What about DEI fatigue? Are you seeing that? Where does it come from? What should be done?
Absolutely. Of course we're seeing it. We have a number of jurisdictions. I think it's something like over 20 now. Jurisdictions that have literally some kind of legislation or local mandate or policy that essentially outlaws doing DEI work. But where is it coming from? And let's look a little bit more at a local level. And ironically, I literally just before hopping on this call, I was analyzing a needs assessment report that we're doing for a client. And it reminded me of the last 2 that we've done, the exact same pattern. When we disaggregate and we look at different groups, we see the groups that have the best experience in the organization, that think they can get promoted, that feel included, that feel like the organization is a fabulous place to work, those are also consistently the groups that least appreciate and are the least supportive of DEI work. So typically, who is it that has the best experience? They are the groups that are male, that are 50-ish age, that are white, that are straight, that are cisgender, and who are the groups that are the least supportive of DEI work, where we see and hear the fatigue. Those groups that are male, that are white, that are 50-ish age group, that are straight, are cisgender. So it's no wonder. Let's put those two things together. The folks that have the most advantage, the folks that have the most power are the ones that are saying, no, why do we need this stuff? Well, from their experience, we don't. That's really where the fatigue is coming from. Yet they've got loud voices and the ability to create the legislation and the local policy that we're seeing.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Okay, Toby, over to you on that question about DEI fatigue.
Yeah, it is a real thing. When I was working inside businesses, I would go along to meetings and I would talk to senior leaders about diversity and inclusion, and I would see their body language close down. They would sit there with their arms crossed. They would roll their eyes. They would stop paying attention. And I think it is because of this diversity fatigue. People, that when we talk about diversity, it seems to be creating more divisions and highlighting our differences. And I know it sounds weird because diversity is about our differences, but it's about celebrating our differences. It's about understanding that our diversity, our different lived experiences, our different backgrounds, our different perspectives, our different opinions actually help us create better outcomes in business. We're better at problem solving. We're better at innovation. We're better at creativity. But when you talk to senior leaders about the D word, that's where we start to see this body language, and they're like, oh, not this again. And a colleague of mine who runs his own consultancy company here in the UK, he's got this saying. He says that diversity is a given, inclusion is a choice. Here in the UK, and it's the same over in America, we have a diverse nation. We are an incredibly diverse society. We have diversity on our doorstep. The question is, are we running businesses that is enabling this diversity to get inside our companies and benefit our companies? And when I work with my clients, I want to shift them towards focusing more on inclusion, creating that culture. Because if we get the culture right, if we have a culture where people feel respected for who they are, where they're empowered to do their best work, where they feel like they belong, where they feel like they can progress their careers, if we're creating that kind of environment, then our businesses are in a lot more stronger position to be able to attract and recruit and retain the diverse talent that does exist out there. And something I've been doing lately, and it seems to be working with senior leaders, is getting them to really think about equity and understand that actually we need to make sure that we're providing equity, that we're creating a level playing field. Because for anybody who's been working in HR, they're trained to focus on equality. They're trained to treat everybody the same because that's fair, that's the right thing to do, without understanding that unfortunately we live in a society where we don't have a level playing field, that there are people who face additional barriers in being able to gain employment or progress within employment. So I know that there's, particularly in America, there's a move towards kind of trying to remove equity from the equation, but we can't create equality if we don't address equity or inequities first. My final point, and this is a bit of a plug for a hero of mine in the D&I space. When I first moved into diversity and inclusion, when I was working at the BBC, one of the most informative books that I ever read was called The Human Equity Advantage by a D&I expert over in Canada. And I managed to get the opportunity to interview him on my podcast last year. And normally I interview somebody for like 20 to 30 minutes. I ended up talking to him for 90 minutes because he was just so interesting. And he really focuses on the importance of equity to help us level the playing field.
The part I'm left with, well, that maybe the focus, we have to shift our focus possibly to inclusion. At least that was the thought I was left with. All right. We are getting to the end of the questions. This is the last question I have for the panel. So if you're out there watching and you have a question, I see Darren has asked a question. Darren will get to that in about 10 minutes. But if anybody out there also has a question, please put it in the chat. We will see that. And I will ask the panel to weigh in on that in about 10 minutes. Now, the final question I have for the panel is, how do the DEI efforts of individual practitioners need to adapt to societal change? We do have this momentum that's going at the moment. And basically, the question is here, what advice do you have for DEI professionals who may be listening? And I'm going to ask Amy, as someone who's working in an organization, to lead us off on answering this question. Amy.
The first thing I would say is don't buy into the societal bylines that you see flashing across your screen every day as fact and truth for every country, every company, every industry. And remember that the work has to continue. So that the first message I have is the DE&I fatigue that we brought up before is not just being felt by the people receiving the work. It is also being felt by the people doing the work. It is, this work it's very exhausting because you want to see the change. And that change is going to potentially take longer than you have to live this life. This is a long-term thing. So I would say that first. The second is try not to perpetuate a dichotomous relationship with DE&I, meaning it's one thing or another, or it's all or nothing. Like you have to do this approach and this is the thing that's going to work. You have to be multidimensional as a DE&I practitioner. You have to be willing to not go after the one size fits all solution. So for example, all of us here have either written a book or about to write a book. All of these books are relevant towards the solution. Not one single person has the answer. And so as a DEI consultant, being willing, or a practitioner, if you will, in a business, being willing to hear all of the potential solutions, and even those, to Lino's point, even those who you may not agree with, because you're going to get a best third solution when we listen to more. And, two things can be true. The other thing that I wanted to touch on here, well, two things. One is challenge others to take steps towards real behavioral change, and really connect people together with stories. We see this in the movies all the time, where, you have two people who didn't understand each other and all they had to do was talk and find the common ground. And then all of a sudden everything's great and the movie is awesome. It's not lost on us that the stories and our life experiences are what connect us. And then it's up to us to help build the bridges to create those opportunities for people to see people differently in a different light. And then the only other thing is we have to meet people where they are. To Lino's point, he was talking earlier about, some of the work that's being done is silly because it does feel exclusive. It does feel divisive. And we are, in some cases, some people are trying to force things down people's throats. I say all the time, like, I love cheesecake, but if somebody shoves a cheesecake in my mouth, I'm going to spit it back out. It doesn't matter how sweet the message is. Doesn't matter how good it tastes to you. It's about how it's delivered and how it's presented and what's being done. This is a deep educational, as a former educator, this is a deep educational philosophy. You don't walk into a classroom and assume every kid is ready to receive the information the same way. You have to differentiate. You have to make sure that you're meeting them where they are. It's no different here. We have to meet people where they are and then give them the nudge to move and make those behavioral changes, so that the field, that the policies, the procedures, the things that we're doing inside of the business, outside of the business, and society are moving in the right direction together.
Thanks, Amy. I love that idea of meeting people where they are. I think we all have that notion that that's a good idea, but sometimes that's hard. All right, Lino, your thoughts on this question. What advice do you have for DEI professionals who might be listening?
Well, there's a number of things that Amy just said that I would piggyback on. The one that sticks out for me the most is if any program you're engaged, let's say we're specifically talking about DEI practitioners, right? Any program that you're going to engage, if it's framed as you have to, it doesn't set a great taste on the tongue. Get tos feel good, right? When DEI is done well, it is an abject get to. The problem is that for a lot of practitioners, your entry point, and so I'm speaking directly to the practitioners, for those of you whose entry points were the politics of it, there's a giant swath of this field that you have missed because what you have likely been absorbing is majority politics. And so the science of this should not be lost, whether it's the sociology, the social psychology, the psychology of it. There's a reason that we built the platform in the way that we did it. So as Sarah was saying, when we do needs assessments, when we do culture audits, when we do leadership development, whether it's personal metrics or whether it's culture metrics, you're not looking at point in time. You give a benchmark. Here's where you are. And it's part of the reason we developed predictive analytics. We can show you where to go. And none of this is political. None of this is about the politics. It's about science and about tying that science to what DEI really is. It's not about the number of those bodies. When you have more diverse bodies in your organization, to Amy's point from earlier, they stay and they thrive if the space in which they live is healthy. Mercer did a massive study of the financial sector in 2017. It was focused in gender. Amy had mentioned some of the American data. The Canadian data was really telling, and it echoed the same thing as it would echo in Britain and anywhere else around the world in terms of DEI. Across the financial sector, at the bottoms, women were like 60-something%. By the time you got to the executive suite, down to 15%. Not surprising. What was really interesting in the data was that as you went up the chain, women were leaving at higher rates, until when you got to the top, they were leaving at twice the rate of their male counterparts. And these are positions where you're making a lot of money. So how bad does it have to be? What you have to think about is if you're not creating a culture where people feel safe, where people feel safe to fail forward, welcome, belonging, all of that good stuff, A, why the hell would they stay? And B, how could they thrive if they did stay? If you're a woman who gets that position because you're qualified, competent, high potential, how do you know for sure you got the job for the right reason? And then while you're working on the job, how do you know your colleagues aren't wondering whether you got the job for the right reason? All of those dynamics are in play if you don't do DEI well. So it is fundamentally necessary that you tie DEI more on the E and the I piece, the equity in terms of the systems in which your organizational systems, that they're equitable. But the I in terms of how we are with each other. And that has, it's deeply tied to performance. There are lots of performance equations out there. The one that I think fits the most tightly with what we do in DEI came out of the University of Toledo. I think it was Dr. Longnecker who was part of that team. But their performance equation is performance equals talent times support times motivation times focus. If you get those four things going well, then you get strong performance. Well, how do you know you got the right talent if you don't have an equity-informed talent process, if you're not getting the actual best people for the job as opposed to the people that you tend to draw from? How do you have support for that talent if your leaders aren't inclusive leaders? How do you have your people motivated if the environment in which they work isn't inclusive, isn't one where they feel belonging? How can they focus if they don't feel psychologically safe? These things are fundamental to work life. But when people think of DEI, they think of, color of skin and gender and those things. They don't tie it to what we actually want, which is people to work well together and be able to be at their best.
I am going to have to look up that equation. That is really interesting. Okay, we have one question, and it was asked by Darren, and I think it's a great question. And the question is, how do we best support the straight, white, able-bodied male leaders and capture their interest and influence them to be allies and active in our work? I think it's a great question. Is there a panelist who would like to respond to this? And I think Sarah can't hear us, so I guess that leaves Toby, Amy, and Lena.
I'm happy to begin if you like.
Okay, go Toby.
Yeah, something I found really effective is we get the leader to identify a time when they felt like they haven't belonged, because there are many times that we have all had a sense of not feeling like we don't belong somewhere. And I did this exercise with a team of senior leaders, and there was one senior leader who said, actually, there's very often I go out for dinner with like a group of my partner's friends, and they love talking about football, but I cannot stand football. And I was like, that's interesting, tell me more. And so the more we dug into it, that's when he could get a sense of what it felt like to not be part of the conversation, to feel like he was excluded somehow, that he didn't belong. And then I got him to try and equate that to the workplace. I said, okay, so take what you're feeling. Now transfer that to the workplace. What might that be like for a colleague who feels like they don't belong in your team? I just want to kind of round that off when in my book, and I'm going to really embarrass myself now because I can't remember the person who came up with this model. But what they say is that when you're trying to affect change, there's kind of three responses. There's, I don't get it, I don't like it, and I don't like you. What that means is that I don't get it means that you need to appeal to someone's logic. They don't understand the logic or the business case or the rationale. So you need to appeal to that side of people. The I don't like it is an emotional response. So you need to create that safety for people to feel like they actually feel ready for the change. And then the one I find interesting, which I think a lot of people feel awkward about, is I don't like you. They need to trust the messenger. So what that comes back to is if you've got a senior leader in an organization who is saying that they want the business to become more diverse and more inclusive, if that senior leader is not saying it with authenticity, then people are not going to buy into that. So it's really key that senior leaders are really driving the DEI agenda with authenticity.
Is there anybody else who wants to weigh in on Darren's question about the able-bodied male leaders and their engagement?
I can take a quick shot at it.
Thanks, Lino.
Don't make them feel like idiots for not getting it. That's the starting point. I think, again, from the early 2000s until, mid-teens, a lot of DEI practitioners got a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card, meaning you could do the work, you do a training, and if people didn't get it, you can say, well, that's because you're resistant, that's because you're the oppressor, you just don't want to see it. And it always reminded me of the kid in high school who failed the test and blamed the teacher. Teacher doesn't like me. Unfair test. Maybe you should have studied. And it's sort of the same thing. If you haven't been able to get across to somebody what you're trying to get across to them, the easiest route is to just blame them for not getting it, or suggest they don't want to see it. I think it's far more difficult for human beings to look at ourselves and say, what could I do differently? And part of that process is building rapport. This is tricky stuff. This is scary stuff for a lot of folks. And there is a massive gap between our intent and impact. The human beings are super peculiar. We have really peculiar little imbecilities. And one of them is that we judge ourselves by our intent. Everybody else judges us by our impact. So it's like, I'm old enough. I remember this 20 years ago, you could be a guy who makes a blonde joke at work. And, blonde jokes are universally about women. They're just sexist jokes. Blonde men don't get this joke made about them, right? You make a blonde joke, and if the woman had an issue with it, you could say, you're reading too much into it. You're overly sensitive. I didn't mean it that way. You shouldn't take it that way. And you could externalize the pathogen that way. It's her problem. The world started to make a good shift. And here we are again, where all of a sudden you're too sensitive. So part of the reason is if you don't see it and your intent, you just think it's a joke because you don't have to live it. You have no reason to see the impact on the other side. Your job as a DEI practitioner is to help people be able to see the other side. That requires curiosity. Why are they missing it? What's your worldview? Why do you see it that way? And that only comes when you do it without judgment. There's a challenge now that you and I and all of us in the field are working with. You can be uninformed about something. Just you don't know what you don't know. You can be misinformed. That's like everybody who asked their Uncle Joe about climate change. It will give you some nonsense explanation unless Uncle Joe was a climate scientist. So you'd be completely misinformed about climate change. And then you can be disinformed. And disinformed is a political activity. Disinformation is someone feeding you information in a way to have you believe and think and drive in a certain way. And the unfortunate reality is if you take 100 leaders who watch MSNBC and 100 leaders who watch Fox News, they do not live in the same world. They do not live in the same world. And you will not move one of them by saying you're stupid and you're an idiot and you don't want to see it. Starting with some empathy and some genuine curiosity, it's kind of a must for what we do.
Okay, we have another question from Julianne. And she's directing it specifically to Lino and Amy. How should companies incorporate DEI efforts into their everyday fabric so that DEI is not the first to be axed when facing monetary challenges? Amy, would you like to lead off on this?
Yeah, happy to start. It's a good question because sometimes these are circumstances out of our control. Anybody could have the best laid plan, strategy, everything. It's really comes down to the leadership buy-in and the value it has to the business. And so I had the fortunate ability to start DE&I at Paycor as the first leader in at this business particularly. And so, building ground up, it really, and I can only speak from, my personal experience, but what my suggestion would be is something that Lino touched on very early in our conversation is your strategy has to be integrated with the goals of the business. You can't create something that stands separately and standalone and here's the business strategy and here's the DE&I strategy over here. It has to be integrated into every single thing that the business is doing and wants to accomplish in order for it to be seen as valuable, which also includes figuring out how to put actionable goals in place that contribute to the bottom line. That could be supplier diversity, for example. It could be cost savings. So building a supplier diversity program, which is something that we are doing now because we finally grown to the point where we need that, is cost savings. It's not just cost earnings and spreading wealth into diverse businesses. It's also saving money for the business. So if you can integrate strategy into various parts of the business and demonstrate how the business would not benefit, like wouldn't be better without it, that is one very solid way to substantiate, or if you still need that buy-in. The other part of it is, again, to Leno's point, building that rapport with your leadership and ensuring that you're building those relationships in a way that helps them understand the purpose and the why is really about people feeling better at work. And one of the things that I wanted to report out on, there was a 4-decade study done at UC Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley, so in the States, on emotional intelligence. And they found that emotional intelligence, so empathy, psychological safety, thinking about self and others, was 400 times more likely to predict the success of anyone in any industry, regardless of role, title, or industry, more than technical skills. And what that says is people want to feel good at work. They want their managers to support and believe in them so they can grow, develop, and build the business. If you can use that kind of data for a business and say, hey, we're going to be 4 times as likely to be successful here if we invest in the people. Those are the kinds of strategies that actually move and build and grow and become sustainable and not disposable, if you will.
Leno, do you have anything to add to that just quickly, because we are getting to the top of the hour?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had to because Amy just plugged my company. The baseline, yeah, thank you. The baseline of everything we do, the science that's baked into the platform, is based in emotional intelligence. And part of the strategy and why we designed it this way and why it ties into organizational systems, it's one of the challenges DEI has is it generally adds work. You got to do a training. You got to change behavior. When you add work, there's friction. Our approach and our methodology and the system is designed to take work away, whether it's synthesized workflows so that people are leveraging that emotional intelligence so people are working better together. We're already at 1 o'clock. I can't keep going on. But leveraging the science and the metrics and taking work away is a pretty fundamental part of doing DEI in a way that it can't just be taken away.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Aiden.
All right. Sabine asked a question. Sabine, what I think we'll do is I will put an answer to your question, and I'll probably tap Sarah and Toby to answer that question. And I'm going to put it in the show notes. And Sabine's question, for anybody out there who's watching or listening, the question Sabine asked was, would any of you be able to share some success stories regarding closing the gaps between leaders and or employees who are resistant? Sabine will get an answer to that in the chat. Thanks for all who are listening out there. I will get this up. We can view it again on YouTube, and I will put it in the podcast as well. Thank you so much to all your panelists. There were so many times in that conversation where I thought, oh, I should record an episode on that. I should record an episode on that. So you may see some of that coming, because I think there were just some awesome ideas and concepts in there that would really advance the practice of HR that I'd like to delve in further. I will put links to all the panelists and to all their corporations, their organizations in the show notes. And otherwise, we are maybe a couple minutes over. Thanks for participating and watching out there, and tune into the show. You'll see some follow-up, I'm sure, in the future.